Tamara Copeland, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you on with me today.
Thank you so much.
Tamara, in addition to the thrill, it's an absolute honor having known a lot about your background and the impact you've had on this region. Now, I open up these conversations by asking people about their upbringing because upbringings impact us. I know that you have a brilliant book that I hope everyone reads, Daughters of the Dream, that really goes deep into your upbringing, but would love to touch a little bit about it for this podcast also. You grew up in Richmond, Virginia, which a lot of people might not reflect on. That was the capital of the Confederacy.
Right.
So curious how that upbringing in Richmond impacted you, Tamara.
Well, I grew up in a Leave It to Beaver kind of world. I grew up in a segregated world and in a middle class world, and I think that's important. On one side of my home, lived the first appointed vice mayor of Richmond, African American vice mayor of Richmond, lived on one side of me. On the other side of my home was a couple. The woman was a domestic worker and the husband was a house painter. Across the street was a university professor, and next door to them was a high school guidance counselor. And so I say all that just to say that it was a community of, I felt safe and I saw all kinds of professions around me. So I'm an only child, and growing up in Richmond, even as Richmond as the capital of the Confederacy, my parents raised me to see possibilities. I never knew about the things I could not do. Those were all kept from me. And so all I saw were possibilities in the world.
And there were lots of possibilities, including when you were in sixth grade, you got a chance to attend an integrated school for the first time.
That's correct. Up until then, I had gone to Albert V. Norrell Elementary School, which is a segregated school. Albert V. Norrell was an educator in Virginia, and it was named after him, an African American educator. And you know what else? I had at that school, I had a female principal, Mrs. Overby, and she was the first African American woman to be the principal of a school. And I just remember that when I was at that school, I knew that everyone from Mrs. Overby, the principal, to the support staff and the maintenance crew, that everybody wanted me to succeed. That everybody in that school. And then in the sixth grade, I had the opportunity, or we were allowed, it's not really an opportunity, we were allowed, African Americans were allowed to go to the white school, which at the time was named Jeb Stuart. And for anyone who doesn't know, Jeb Stuart it was a Confederate general. And that was who the school was named after. And I have to say that that really had no impact on me. I had no idea who Jeb Stuart was. No one told me. And nobody celebrated him. So that was just the school's name for someone who's 10 or 11 years old. But one of the most memorable parts of my life happened is on just about the first day of school. It was probably maybe a day or two before the first day of school. And my mom told me something that I had never heard her say. She said, I want you to remember that white people don't always tell the truth. Well, that was an interesting comment. First, we didn't really talk about white people at my house. And I knew that she meant adults. She didn't say that, but I knew that I just intuitively knew she was talking about adults. And I think she was concerned about the messages that I might receive from either the teachers in the school or the administrators in the school or the parents of my classmates. I suspect that's what she was concerned about. But it was a very different message for me to hear that adults don't always tell the truth.
What an insightful observation by your mom, Tamara, because we know to this day that the expectations teachers have of their students has a significant impact on the potential for those students to
Yeah.
do well in school and beyond. So your mom wanted you to have that in the back of your mind as you were going to this new environment.
And I had a really good experience at that school. I have to tell one little story. One day, my parents and I were in the backyard of our home, and all of a sudden looked up, and there was my sixth grade teacher, my sixth grade white teacher, at the gate to the backyard, Mr. Yearwood. And I was shocked that my teacher was there. I think my parents were shocked that this white man was there in a black neighborhood. And Mr. Yearwood had come to convince my parents that I didn't need to be in the sixth grade, that I should skip the sixth grade. And I am very fortunate that my parents made the decision that I stay with my group of friends that were going to that school and going to other schools as we integrated the school system. I was not the first class. I think I was the second or third class of African American students going to what predominantly white schools. But it was important to have my friendship group as my support network as I went on through school. So yeah, sixth grade was an important year for me.
Yeah, and you obviously had adults like your teacher that cared enough to advocate on your behalf. But it wasn't until college that you started recognizing what it is truly like to be African American or be Black.
I think that it was, you're correct. It certainly was in college, but it wasn't about necessarily being in college. It was the times. It was just the time. So I was in college in the early 70s, and Black is beautiful, and there was more of a Black power movement, and there was more of a recognition of celebrating who we were, who we are as African Americans, as opposed to trying to move into a white world. So up until then there had been more of an emphasis on trying to get into the white community, trying to assimilate in a way. But about that time, afros came into vogue. People were wearing African inspired clothing. There was more of a recognition of not only of our roots and our heritage, but also of our people. And I think that while you are quite correct that that happened while I was in college, it really didn't have a lot to do with college, just with kind of the culture and the times.
So, with that understanding, with that transition that was happening at that time, obviously you were a woman getting a job down in Virginia.
Hmm.
And you shared an experience that you went to the Virginia General Assembly in a
Yeah,
pantsuit,
yeah.
and you were told that that's not the way women dress in the Virginia General Assembly. Now,
It,
this is in the 1970s, Tamara.
that's absolutely correct. I came into work that day, and I thought I looked professional and appropriate, and I did. I had on a pantsuit, and you were. It's important that you do emphasize when this was occurring, and where, because it's Virginia. And so I was going to meet with someone who in the Virginia legislature, and the woman who ran the organization or the agency that I worked for was a state agency. And she was very politically astute, and it was part of my political training. And she told me, first she said, you need to go home and change clothes. And it was very abrupt, and I asked her why, what was wrong with how I looked, and she said, well, there's nothing wrong with how you look, but you have to decide what your message is. So is your message that you can wear whatever you want to the Virginia General Assembly, because people are going to be more focused on what you are wearing because it's outside of the norm than what you are saying. So you have the right to do that. You have the right to wear that suit and to go there and try to talk about children's issues, which is what I was being paid to do. Um, or you have to put on the proper uniform, which is a dress or a skirt, and then go and talk about children's issues. So it was an important lesson that we all want to be able to dress a certain way, but there is an expectation, and you can decide that you don't choose to meet that expectation, and you can certainly be successful doing that. But it was an important lesson for me to learn at the time.
But I wonder about that, Tamara. As leaders, we all have to balance how much we conform
Mhm.
to be able to advocate on behalf of whatever causes we support, pull people along with us? And at what point do we choose that we are not going to conform and we're going to force the group to
Right.
accept that nonconformity? And I imagine you've had numerous ones of these challenges all throughout your own leadership career.
I think you're absolutely correct. But you used a key word, a choice. And as long as we know that we are consciously making a choice to make a certain statement and to push the envelope in a way, and I believe that that always occurs in any at any point in history, that people push the envelope. They push the envelope about how they physically look. When I was speaking earlier about afros coming into vogue, or braids or dreadlocks or whatever the hairstyle or the dress that you choose, that there's someone who's always the first, and that person risks their career, or they risk promotions, um, but they make a conscious effort and a conscious decision that having the right to be who you are is far more important than conforming to a standard that doesn't fit you, that you're trying to put the square peg in the round hole, and there's no reason to do that.
It is, and it does take pushing those boundaries. So if we look at all kinds of movements, including
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter movement,
Mhm.
initially people are ostracized and they are in the margins.
Right.
Eventually, part based on leadership, part based on external circumstances, they the majority end up slowly transitioning and accepting what they were advocating from early on.
You're absolutely correct. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so Tamara, you continue and you had a significant impact on as a child advocate, whether it was in the Southern Regional Project on infant mortality, or as an in Voices for America's Children.
Mhm.
Before talking a little bit about those that I would love for you to go into, what was it about children that got you so energized and excited to pursue making an impact, specifically with infants and children?
That's a great question. I wish I had a great answer. I don't know what led me in that direction. I really don't. But I certainly have always recognized the importance of providing opportunities to young people as they go through life, and really position them to be effective leaders. But now that you've asked me the question, let me think about that for just a second and say this. When I graduated from college, I graduated a semester early, and you spoke to Richmond, and I had a sociology degree. And you absolutely do nothing with a BA in sociology. There's nothing to be done. And so I was going to work for what at the time was called the Richmond Department of Public Welfare, and now Social Services. And I was wanted to be a foster care caseworker, to work with children in foster care. And because I graduated a semester early, Virginia, you had to have a degree in order to be a foster care caseworker. And while I had a letter from my university that said I had met all requirements for graduation, they only actually awarded diplomas once a year. So I didn't have that piece of paper that said the diploma. But anyway, so I was a food stamp technician for 3 months or 4 months because you could be a food stamp technician with just 2 years of college as opposed to four. And anyway, to get to the core of the story, I think once I ended up as a foster care caseworker, I realized how poorly those children in that system were treated, at least at the time that I was working there. I knew how to fill out every form, but I truly was so ill prepared to provide any level of quality services to young people, some of whom were not significantly younger than I was. I was probably 22, and some of them were 17. Um, I also learned. So I learned a lot there. I learned about a system that did not truly provide services, and I also learned that I was not of the temperament to believe that you change the world one person at a time. That's when I recognized the power of public policy and really wanted to look for opportunities to affect change on behalf of children, but in the public policy arena and working at a level, a macro level, as opposed to one child at a time.
It is pretty interesting perspective because while it does take a champion's heart and effort to serve at the individual level, a lot of the issues that are faced in this case with infants and
Hmm.
children
Hmm.
are systemic issues
Right.
that need to be addressed. And that's why you pursued impacting them with policy. So, when you went on specifically with the National Association of Child Advocates,
Hmm.
what was your role there and how were you able to make an impact through that effort?
So this is an organization that actually no longer exists under either of its names. But the National Association of Child Advocates was an organization with member groups in, I'm not going to remember now, but probably when I left, maybe 40 some states. And those organizations at the state level worked with their state legislatures and their governor's offices on children's legislation, on policies that affect kids at the state level. And it's very comparable to a group called the Children's Defense Fund, a name that I think many people might be familiar with the work of the Children's Defense Fund. So Children's Defense Fund was working at the national level, and the members of the National Association of Child Advocates were working at the state level on pretty comparable kinds of legislation across the whole array of issues that affected kids. So they were looking at health issues, at education issues, at child welfare issues like the foster care system, at juvenile justice issues. So the whole array of issues. And when I came on board, and I was the president of the organization, one of the things that we did was to change the name and try to have the kind of branding that actually positions people to have more power when you are part of a network. So Voices for America's Children became the name, and it's kind of interesting that when we were looking at names, possible names, we realized that everyone said they were the voice for children in Nebraska, or they were the voice for children in Florida, or wherever. And so Voices for America's Children became the name of the organization, and some of the state chapters then adopted the same name. And to this day, there's still a Voices for Virginia's Children, and some of the others still exist at the state level. But one of the things that we recognized was the power of constituents. That while the Children's Defense Fund was speaking for on behalf of children at the national level, there was an even greater power when someone from the home state of a member of Congress came to speak to him or her about issues and actually represented that state. So when you go to a Virginia senator and you are from Richmond or you are from Winchester or you are from Williamsburg, you have a very different power than being from Washington, D.C. And so it's not to suggest that one is more important than the other, but there is a complementarity to having an organization like the Children's Defense Fund while also having people from the states who are speaking on behalf of constituents. So part of what we were trying to do was to move that organization from being not only state focused, but to also recognizing their power at the federal level.
So you were able to do that, and I wonder then what eventually, over time, brought you to RAG, which you definitely did a masterful job of leading and having tremendous impact. Why RAG?
Well, I actually didn't know a lot about RAG, and it's interesting that a member of my Leadership Greater Washington class suggested that I apply for the job. And my world in Washington, as you well know, there are three universes, as I think of it, in Washington. There's the local community, there's the national community, there's the international community. And and those three divisions rarely interact. And so I was at the national level. I ran a national organization that happened to be here. But I didn't know a lot about the local community. And when my classmate in Leadership Greater Washington started talking with me about this organization, I didn't know a lot about it, but I knew that I wanted to work at the local level. So I will constantly praise her for introducing me to RAG, to the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, because it was a very powerful experience in my life.
It was a powerful experience, and you were a powerful leader for it, with a lot of successes we'll get to. But one experience that also taught you a lesson, which was the experience around post Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae,
Ah,
which were
yeah.
big corporate citizens in the greater Washington, D.C. region, contributing lots of different ways. When they went into conservatorship,
Yes.
conservatorship,
Yes.
uh, you pulled together the Eight Neighbors Collaborative. What was that all about, and what lessons did that experience teach you?
Yeah, that was a sad Sunday because it actually happened on a Sunday. It was interesting. On a Sunday, it was announced that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were going into conservatorship, and I didn't know what that meant. But what I knew was that seemed like that was a significant event, and that as major funders in the region, as well as across the country, but certainly in the region, that it was going to affect their giving because their funds were being held by the federal government in a way that I didn't quite understand, but I knew that they weren't having access to them. And so it was very apparent immediately, right away, that the philanthropic community was going to be called on to the other members of the philanthropic community were going to be called on to fill the void left by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And we couldn't do it. I mean, these were significant contributors. There was no way that the local community could do that. And so to pull together a group of people representing philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, the business community, and local government, and just recognizing that those were the communities that were going to be impacted. We called all of them on Monday, the Monday after this happened, and we came together for the first time on Friday. So pretty immediately, because we all saw it, we all knew that this was a big deal. So we came together on Friday. This was in September, and we met every Friday through December, every Friday, and there was such creativity because we came together, and it was, what are we going to do? And the first thing was that we were going to have a shared message, that we were going to say, we know that this is a significant event. we are going to work together to figure out how we will address it. We had to have a shared political message. We had a shared message that went to the Virginia delegation in Congress, the Maryland delegation, as well as to DC, to say that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were important members of the local community, that there were organizations as well as families and individuals that relied on the kinds of services that were provided by the organizations that their philanthropic dollars supported. So we wanted to have that message to go to the congressional delegations. And then we convened the community. We had a session that we called something. It was called 911, nonprofit 911, I think, where we convened people to have an opportunity to talk about what this was going to do to their organizations. And we thought, we thought 50 people would come, 100 people would come. I don't remember the exact number, but I think we had about 500 people who
Wow.
came to that conference, that 911 conference, just to be able to share their concerns about the impact on this. And we made a difference that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae both made philanthropic contributions that year. They made them literally on New Year's Eve, and they told their grantees that their contributions to the community would stop, but they would stop over time. So I don't remember whether it was 3 years or 5 years, but there was a gradually the funds diminished, but people had a chance to prepare for that in a different way. But the thing about the 8 neighbors, which really was a great group, is that once there was some level of resolution to the presenting problem, I had hoped we would just stay together, that we would stay together as a group that was prepared for whatever the next regional crisis would be, because of course there always is one. There's something that happens, not always, there's an always one, but something else comes up. Um, and we couldn't stay together. We just couldn't. There wasn't that shared enemy. The conservatorship was the shared enemy, that we had something immediately in common. And once that was gone or resolved to some degree, we didn't stay together.
That's an interesting perspective, Tamara, both for organizational leaders and leaders in the region. When there is a shared enemy, it is easier to align people and have them charge toward a
Yes.
shared purpose. When there isn't one, it's a lot harder. And then in this entire region, the region comes together when there are those shared challenges,
Hmm.
and then the individual leaders go their own way when there
Yes.
isn't. So
Right.
sometimes it is pretty interesting how we can, as a community, continue to pull together leaders and keep them focused on a shared purpose without always having crisis after crisis that needs to be tackled.
Right. I think before the situation with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, there was September the 11th. And my understanding, I wasn't at BRAG at that time, but it's my understanding that the philanthropic community and the larger community came together, in response to the September the 11th event. And I know that in recent times that people have come together in response to the pandemic. So, but it seems like we have to have that presenting event that is pretty catastrophic for us to come together and stay together.
Now, I know you also wanted to tackle racism and issues around race while you were at RAG, and tried repeatedly from 2012 through 2016 without it getting much traction, where the conversations, everyone felt they've been there, they've done that, they've talked about it, it's addressed, and wanted to move on. So, as you were trying to, again, put the conversation on the table, which eventually you were able to do. What were the resistance points? What were the challenges you were facing in getting the community aligned to have this needed conversation?
Yes. Well, in 2012, Trayvon Martin was killed. And that event really affected me to my core in a way that nothing ever had before. And I'm sure that it was because I had a son who was roughly the same age as Trayvon Martin. And I knew that nothing separated the event that happened to Trayvon Martin and from my son's life except time, space, and fate. So there was nothing else. And so it was very difficult for me. And I even reading stories about it or watching it on the news. And finally, I wrote a piece. RAG did a daily compilation of news. And so I had a platform. And I wrote a piece for what we call the Daily Rag and talking about that event. And in this blog post, I mentioned about talking with my son about driving while Black, shopping while Black, doing everyday things as an African American male. And I was surprised, and perhaps I should not have been surprised, but I was surprised by the number of white leaders of philanthropic institutions who came up to me after that after that blog was posted, and said, "You still have to do that?" And I was, I thought, well, of course I still have to do that. And every Black family or family of color, but particularly Black families, have to do that and had to do that in 2012 and have to do that in 2021. Um, so we have to prepare our children for how they will be received and the perceptions that surround them. But because of that particular event, but because of Trayvon Martin's murder, and particularly because of George Zimmerman was exonerated, that I started looking at issues around race and racism and became far more aware than I had ever been in my life about issues of structural racism and not just prejudice and discrimination, which I think that certainly I understood completely. And I think many people of color understand those because it kind of hits you in the face. But structural racism, all of these realities that undergird in an almost invisible way the realities I didn't know, and I think many people didn't know. And when I started talking about, excuse me, wanting to do something around this topic and talking with some of the leaders of the local philanthropic institutions, many people came back to me and they said, well, we already know that. And I'm thinking, really? I didn't know that, so you really already know that? And there certainly was a sense that issues around race and racism people already knew. And that in and of itself is the problem. There is this sense that through legislation that was passed in the 60s, civil rights legislation, that we have addressed issues of race and racism. And that simply isn't true. But it wasn't until, I think anyway, that there was a proliferation of cell phone video images of young African American, not all young, but African American men primarily, but not solely, um, being abused by police officers. And the event that really precipitated the local philanthropic community's interest in this topic was the death of Freddie Gray. And Freddie Gray was a young Black man who lived in Baltimore, and he died as the result of injuries suffered in the back of a police vehicle. And when that happened, there were a number of people in philanthropy who called me as the head of RAG and said, well, what do you think? Do you think that could happen here? I said, I think it could happen anywhere, certainly. So I think proximity of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area to Baltimore and the Freddie Gray incident was part of what led to a receptivity, along with cell phone videos, that led to a receptivity in the local philanthropic community.
And Tamara, your persistence and your leadership has had a significant impact on the way a lot of people view it in this region, because you put the racism conversation on the table. And even when I look at the pivot that Leadership Greater Washington did with the conversations on anti-racism, a lot of it came about as a result of seeds you had planted with the organization and elsewhere, seeds that you were advocating for. And once people became more open to seeing the real systemic racism that exists. So if you and I were having a conversation a few years back, I would have probably also said I understand the individual biases.
Mm-hmm.
What I didn't see, one of the reasons I appreciate the conversation with you and your leadership, is that through guidance from you, through the programming, through the conversations, I have been able to see the systemic issues
Right.
that go into it beyond just the individual biases that people hold. So I think you've truly been impactful advocating for this conversation from back in 2012. And as with these series of unfortunate incidents, as there is more cell phone coverage of it, people's awareness of it has gone higher, then more people have come to the conversation
Mm-hmm.
saying maybe there is something more to this than the individual biases we carry as people.
I think for in our region in particular, the events in Charlottesville in 2017 were significant. I do think proximity matters, and so those events I think were critically important for people to see. I would never minimize the role of cell phone videos. I think those images were very much akin to seeing the dogs attacking young people in Birmingham in the 60s. That when that was shown on television, that there was a different sense of that reality because people could see it. And just this year or the last 12 months, um, because of the pandemic and everyone being at home for the most part in last year, so that when George Floyd was murdered and people watched 8 minutes of this man being killed on television, I think there was a very different sense of what Black Lives Matter means and why saying those words and recognizing that reality that for that particular police officer who appeared very cavalier in the manner in which his knee was on the neck of George Floyd, that I would say that that man's life did not matter to that police officer, and that was just one time of many incidents that we are all becoming aware of.
And again, you have had a significant impact on many leaders' understanding in this region. And I hope we continue to build on that, to build both awareness and action for a more anti-racist community, at least in the greater Washington, D.C. region and beyond. But I know we've had a lot of serious conversations, Tamara, and you have a magnificent, fun personality to you. So I don't want the conversation just to end with the significant impact you've had on all the great organizations, on putting racism on the table, all of these things. In addition to loving walking, food, you are big into word games and decorating shows on TV. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, that is true. I have several passions. So I love to travel. That's a big passion. I try to walk 5 miles a day. But I think what people don't know is that I truly love word games. So I love Boggle and Scrabble and Words with Friends. And if I'm sitting in a doctor's office waiting for an appointment, I'm going to find a word somewhere and figure out how many words I can take out of that word independent. How many words can I find in independent? And so word games are fun for me. And I love decorating. And I love those shows, and I love the food shows and the cooking shows. So yeah, those are my guilty pleasures too.
So you share that in common with my girls, and I know the next time I'm in one of these competitions that we do at Leadership Greater Washington or elsewhere, who to have for a partner in these word games.
Well, I'm a big fan. That doesn't mean I'm good at it. It just means I enjoy it.
That's fantastic, Tamara. Now, if you were to give advice to your younger self as you were starting
Mhm.
out post college, whether with that sociology degree or with your first job, what advice would you give younger leaders and younger Tamara in wanting to be as impactful as you have been throughout your career?
I think um, the advice would be open to possibilities. Just I think the inclination is to plan your course. You know, so I'm going to college, and then I worked for a while as a foster care caseworker. Then I went to grad school, and then I was going to get this job, and I was going to do this, and I was going to do that. And I got that job. I started working at Southern Governors Association. And one day, a friend called me. And some of your listeners will know this friend's name. His name is Bobby Scott. And he's a member of Congress from the Tidewater section of Virginia, who I had known all of my adult life. And he was a child advocate in Virginia, and so that's how our paths connected. But anyway, he called me one day and he said, "I want you to come work for me." And I said, "What would I do?" He said, "I don't know. I'm new at this." And I said, "Well, Bobby, all I know about how a bill becomes a law is what I learned in the fourth grade. I don't know anything." He said, "Well, come work for me." Well, I did. So I went and worked for Congressman Scott as legislative director. I wasn't there very long. I really didn't like working, not for Congressman Scott. He was wonderful, but the institution of Congress was not the right space for me. But I'm glad that I was there, and I'm glad that I was open to that possibility, because you just don't know where the paths may take you. And there are times when you so wanted job X and you didn't get it and you're disappointed, and all of a sudden job Y comes along, and it's much a better fit than you could have ever hoped for. So so my advice to my younger self is, don't get stressed by what doesn't happen, just to be open to what can happen.
What beautiful recommendation and advice, because it seems like a lot of times when leaders have achieved success, they pretend as if they knew exactly all along the way where they were going to end up. And part of what you're saying is you can achieve that success and have an impact being open to possibilities.
Exactly. That's the way I feel. As I said to you earlier, I didn't know what RAG was, and I feel that RAG was an important part of my professional life and a way for me to make a contribution to my community.
Well, Tamara, I truly appreciate obviously your time for sharing some of your leadership, some of your background with the partnering leadership community. And I appreciate your commitment to this region, to the leaders, to putting racism on the table, to the conversations that I know have impacted so many, including me. So thank you so much for all of your leadership, your wisdom, and your friendship, Tamara Copeland.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity.